Since Charlie Kirk's assassination, Republican leaders have been working to rally his young conservative followers and grow their ranks for the future. A striking sign of that came on Monday when Vice President JD Vance hosted Kirk's podcast from the White House complex. He brought on a series of White House officials as guests, including Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. And she acknowledged Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, will be pivotal to continued Republican success at the ballot box.
And now we have 3.5 years to convert Trump voters to being Republicans.
Sure.
So that in 2028, we can keep the White House, the House, and the Senate. That's what Charlie helped us think through. He cannot be replaced by any one person.
Consider this. Charlie Kirk played a key role in shifting young Americans to the right, and that helped put President Trump back in the White House. So what happens next? I'm Scott Detrow. It's Consider This from NPR. For more on this, we're going to bring in NPR's Elena Moore, who covers young voters and youth politics. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Scott.
It's been about a week since Charlie Kirk died. He was a massive figure on the beat that you covered. There's a lot to talk about. I want to talk about one specific thing first. What is the best way to think about Turning Point USA's impact on the last election? How much was Charlie Kirk personally, organizationally responsible for putting Donald Trump back in the White House?
It's a big mix. I mean, the first thing I'll say is Charlie Kirk was a unique political figure. He was a young person. When he died, he was 31 years old. He got into the political world at just 18. He started Turning Point USA when he was in 2012, in the height of former President Obama's second term, second campaign, and he created a space that was meant for young conservatives. So he has this more than a decade-long, tenure building a movement that really he saw was missing among young people. So he has, for lack of a better word, clout with this group.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, over the more recent, few years, he really became kind of a youth voice specifically for the MAGA movement. This man espoused a lot of the same beliefs that Trump did, but he was 31. And I think that was a really different message for some people. Plus, he had a huge platform spanning, millions across TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. So it was just a really powerful voice. On the ground side, we can't, pinpoint any specific group or person, directly to campaign success. But what we can say and what we know is that Turning Point Action, the advocacy wing of Turning Point USA, which started several years ago, worked directly with the Trump campaign to organize on the ground in key swing states like Arizona and Michigan. And so we know that unlike in 2020, Turning Point was right there alongside the Trump campaign. And we know that the Trump inner circle really valued Kirk's input throughout the campaign.
One of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the past week, I remember on election night, people from the Kamala Harris campaign reaching out to reporters as in those final hours of voting saying, we're getting reports of long lines at various colleges, and we feel really good about that. And it turns out a lot of the people in those long lines were there to vote for Donald Trump, and that was a real sea change over what we expect from young voters. Kirk played a big role in that. I think people were surprised. Some people were surprised at just like the deep connections that people who followed him, who watched his videos, who were part of his organizations felt for him. Certainly, he was provocative. He was controversial. He said things that offended a lot of people, but a lot of that was also the same reason that people were drawn to him. Like, what's the best way to think about his individual presence before we talk about what happens now that he's gone?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason he started this whole group was he felt that if you were a young conservative, he would argue that you couldn't speak your mind without, essentially being canceled, for lack of a better term. You couldn't speak your mind without being shunned from social situations. And I think, that's why he did this. He had this series where he would go to different campuses and debate people and really not shy away from tough topics in kind of hopes of getting, a viral moment. And that's kind of how his face, spread across the world and over the last few years. But I think that Kirk also tapped into something that we've talked about before, which is that he broadened his message to be one of conservatism, but it's a social conservatism and it's like a cultural conservatism. He talked a lot about what he would describe as traditional family values. And, broader than just that, there was this overarching message that I heard from him a lot, that he said a lot, which was, he said that he wants the Republican Party to give people a better life than their parents had, kind of this American dream message. And that's one that people can take as an economic message, but it's also one that could easily translate into that social conservatism message as well of, the traditional family that your parents might have had, the traditional faith structure. And so I think that that's a message more broadly. We want to give you a better life than your parents. I think it's one that we've seen Republicans kind of co-opt and use to just be an olive branch to young people.
He also said a lot of inflammatory things. He was a big promoter of election denial in 2020. One of the main forces saying that Trump won an election that Trump decidedly lost. He was a big voice against vaccine mandates, and he often, when he talked about LGBTQ rights, would really single out transgender people in ways that a lot of people found deeply offensive and hurtful.
Yeah, I think we can't emphasize enough that this was truly a divisive figure. This was someone who was really, hated by a lot of people for his views, and then also supported by a whole other group of people for his views.
Right.
Kind of for the same reason.
In recent years, there's been a really powerful conservative force of the more certain views are said they're inappropriate, they're not for public consumption, the more that people kind of are drawn to people who go ahead and say them anyway.
Exactly. I think that people saw that from Kirk as kind of a liberating thing, especially for someone on a college campus who maybe felt ostracized by the Democratic Party or pushed away. When I was on the campaign trail, I think that was clear that there were people who just didn't feel seen by the Democratic Party anymore for one reason or another.
Yeah, and the way that he paid attention to the cultural side of this, I think, is important too when we talk about what happens next. Like during Trump's first term, I thought about this idea that Trump and Republicans held power in Washington, but the left really had the cultural power. And it seems like Charlie Kirk played a key role in really leveling that playing field, if not giving an advantage at this point in time to cultural conservatism.
Yeah, I mean, Charlie Kirk was hated by a lot of people, but among the people he was loved by, they really, kind of became his followers and supporters. And it was pretty hard to miss his content. I think if you were a young person online, he had tens of millions of followers. His, Turning Point USA, over the course of, the over a dozen years that it was run by Kirk, kind of morphed into additional, sister organizations, nonprofits that really tailored to specific communities outside of traditional, political wonks. There was a group focused on faith, a group focused on women, and there was a group focused on more political organizing, specifically Turning Point Action. And so, yeah, I think he was able to kind of tap into this larger conservative conversation. And I think that's where he was able to kind of get the attention of a lot of young people, because we know that a lot of people, regardless of age, just don't follow politics at the level that maybe some others who call themselves wonks might, and he was able to, regardless of if it was something that people supported or didn't, he was able to connect a lot of his political beliefs with cultural ones.
So over the past week, what have you seen? What are you paying attention to as you try to figure out what the right does next to fill this space?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of hurting among the people that really supported him. I think that for anyone that came of political age in the last 15 years, which is, I would say, really anyone in their early 30s, anyone in their 20s, even earlier, Charlie Kirk is probably one of the first people you think of when you think of young conservative, young Republican. And so for a lot of young conservatives, young organizers, young elected officials, young content creators, they were inspired by him. In the days since his assassination, we've seen people be very public about their grief and talk about, content creators and conservative folks go on their platforms with millions of followers and be really honest and cry and talk about how Charlie inspired them. And I think it's been interesting to see how open they are in this kind of conversation. They're really not keeping anything private after such a horrific tragedy, death. And I think paired with a lot of these kind of conversations has been the question of what's next, who fills this void. And what people have told me and what people have shared publicly is there's no one person that can fill those shoes, and it's more of a group effort. And it remains to be seen what that looks like. But it's this, thought I've been hearing, or it's the statement I've been hearing over and over. No one can solely step into that spot.
You saw Vice President Vance. We mentioned before that he hosted his podcast, but he also flew out to Utah to retrieve Kirk's body and bring it back to Arizona. And he seems, from his official position, to be trying to fill this void. You also saw Kirk's widow, Erica, deliver a pretty emotional, powerful speech in his old podcast studio. Any sense of whether she takes charge of this organization, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell, but what a striking image that was. Again, just so recently after the loss of her husband, the father of her children, she was making this statement. I believe she had a line that said, you have no idea what you have just unleashed. These very passionate words that I think many have interpreted as calls to action of this kind of necessity to keep Kirk's movement going, because I think you can easily argue that, this young man was kind of just at the start of his political journey. He was just kind of getting into being a really key player among the Trump orbit. And so I think when you're hearing someone so close to him on a personal side speak like that, paired with, the White House playing such a big role in the public memorializing of him, I think it really shows that this is a priority for a lot of prominent MAGA conservative media personalities and politicians to really hold on to this big group.
So as we talk about that, as we talk about people trying to kind of harness these emotions that are created in this moment, is it fair to say that this shooting aside, before it happened, this moment in time, is it fair to say that President Trump was starting to see some possible vulnerabilities with the younger men, especially the group of voters that Kirk was most attached to?
Yeah, look, I think everyone always has hope when you get energized to vote for a candidate. And there's always kind of a reality check moment. I think that's with any age group, but especially when maybe this is your first election or your second, or you were really passionate about supporting Trump. Yeah. We've seen some signs that young conservatives have actually wavered in the support that they had for the president. There was a Pew Research survey recently over the summer that found that there's been a huge drop in Trump supporters under 35 who approve of Trump's job in office. From I think February, it was somewhere in 94%. By August, it dropped to 69, which is the biggest jump of any age group. As for young men, it's interesting. Obviously, Kirk did direct a lot of his messaging to that demographic, and we know that group did shift right, as many groups among young people did. But I actually recently got some interesting data from his podcast, which was also kind of on the up and up. It had climbed the Edison charts, the podcast, the metrics tracking organization, and it actually found that a plurality of his listeners on that show were over the age of 55. It did not skew heavily male. It was, more evenly split, actually, with a slight lean towards women. So I think that he had a different type of following and a wider reach than just young people. And I think that's something the White House was very aware of. We know that he was a big supporter of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Health and Human Services Secretary. And so I think, it also speaks to Kirk was kind of broadening his reach at the same time as being known as this young voice. Yeah. I think with young men, the White House is I think it's part of the reason why we're seeing the White House really own this space right now is they want to make I mean, just from covering young people for years, it feels like a clear signal to me that they're saying, if you felt seen here, you can keep being seen here. We keep seeing you. The other side didn't see you. That's what they would maybe argue. And it's not going away. But we'll see if that sticks.
That's NPR's Elena Moore. Elena, thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott. Happy to do it.
And if you want more conversations like this, you can like and subscribe to our channel and check us out wherever you get your podcasts.